They say you never really know a person until they betray you. I used to think that was just something people said to make themselves feel better after heartbreak. But I know now it's the only real truth left in this world. My name is Michael Cross, and I turned 39 the day I found out my wife was cheating on me. Not through some cinematic confrontation or a text message left open on her phone. No, I found out the way men like me always do, by accident. And far too late. I run a private security consultancy firm in Chicago. Long hours, high stakes, confidential clients. My life was precision, my world controlled by rules and observation. Ironically, I was the one who failed to notice the cracks in my own home. It started 6 months ago, when Laura began working late. She's an interior designer, creative, impulsive, magnetic in a way that made people orbit her. We'd been married for 12 years. We weren't perfect, but I thought we had something stable. Turns out, stability is just another word for blindness. I remember that night like a freeze frame. A Tuesday, late September. Rain hammered the windows. I was home early, bourbon in hand, reviewing a client's file when her phone lit up on the counter. Normally I wouldn't have looked, but the message preview wasn't a name, it was just a number. And the words burned through the glass. Same hotel as last time. Room 408. I read it twice before the noise in my head turned to static. I didn't breathe, didn't move. My mind, trained to analyze every detail, started cataloging. Timestamp, pattern of late nights, changes in her tone, the sudden perfume I didn't recognize. Every clue I had ignored became a bullet, loading one by one into the chamber of realization. I didn't confront her that night. I didn't scream or throw things. I watched her come home, cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes bright. She kissed me, told me she'd been meeting a client, and I smiled. I smiled like the fool I had become. That's when the ideas started forming. Because I'm not a man who believes in chaos. I believe in control. And betrayal, to me, is a problem that requires a solution. Over the next few weeks, I built my plan, quietly, methodically, the same way I've dismantled threats for corporate clients for years. I used tools from work, discrete surveillance, digital tracking, data extraction. I placed a hidden recorder in her car, installed a camera behind a mirror in our bedroom. I even cloned her phone using a backup encryption key. What I found wasn't a casual fling. It was worse. The man's name was David Lang, a managing partner at a real estate investment group that had hired my firm once before. He wasn't just sleeping with my wife, he was using her to get access to me. My company had been negotiating a high-stakes contract for a corporate investigation involving one of Lang's competitors. Laura had access to everything: files, client names, server passwords. And she'd been feeding him information, slowly, consistently. Betrayal on every level: personal, professional, moral. I listened to hours of their conversations. Sometimes it was just the usual pathetic romance. I love you, he'll never know. But one recording changed everything. David, once I have that security access code, the rest falls into place. Laura, he keeps it in the safe. I can get it when he's asleep. David, then it's over. For him, at least. That's when I realized this wasn't just infidelity. It was a setup. Lang was planning to ruin me, steal classified data from one of my contracts, and pin it on me. A corporate sabotage, buried beneath an affair. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my study, staring at the whiskey glass reflecting the glow of the city, and felt something inside me break cleanly in two. One side of me was the man I'd always been: methodical, moral, measured. The other side whispered one word over and over: revenge. The next morning, I started preparing. I moved cash into an untraceable account. I backed up every piece of evidence. I started telling David where he went, who he met, what time he left the office. He thought he was in control, playing both sides. He had no idea he'd already become part of a much bigger game, a darker one. And Laura, she kept playing her part, oblivious. Every lie she told me was a thread I would later pull. Every smile she faked would become another brick in the trap I was building. People think revenge is about emotion. It isn't. It's about patience, precision, and timing. When the time was right, I'd make them both pay. But not with violence, not with blood. No, my revenge would be clean. It would be the kind that destroys a person's world so completely that they don't even realize it's falling apart until they're standing in the ashes. And it all started with a single hotel key. The truth had two faces, the one you wake up to and the one that lives in the dark. I started with the dark. After I found the hotel text, I didn't confront Laura. Confrontation is for men who don't know how to use leverage. Instead, I did what I'd spent half my life doing. I gathered data, triaged it, turned it into advantage. I work in a business where information is currency and privacy is a myth. My firm installs defensive systems for CEOs who keep secrets for a living. We teach companies how to hide things that could burn them down. It's an odd comfort to spend your days building walls for people who then try to hide behind them. The irony that day was that the wall I had to build had to be around my own life, deliberate, invisible, and terrifyingly intimate. I bought new gear, not bloated spy laptop nonsense, but clean surgical tools, an encrypted field recorder the size of a matchbook, a pinhole camera with night contrast that folded into a button, an innocuous-looking OBD dongle we used to test client vehicles, reprogrammed to siphon telematics and phone usages without tripping a single alert. I dug into my firm's database, using admin privileges I'd earned over a decade of clean work. I pulled login histories, access logs, and the one document that would make a man like Lang vulnerable, the chain of custody for the security credentials tied to the client file he wanted. Lang was cautious, deliberately so. He left paper trails only where he believed they'd be safe. Shell companies, offshore accounts, obscure procurement records with Latin names. He thought he was clever because he outsourced cleverness. He'd used Laura's access, but he'd made sure the transaction he wanted to pin on me would look like routine maintenance, a firmware update on a third-party sensor, trivial and easily explained. That firmware update, the one he intended to hijack to siphon data, had to be performed from inside my client's network. The plan was elegant. Laura would get me drunk, convince me to leave my laptop unlocked. A few keystrokes, a thumbprint, a credential swap, the rest would be invisible. The update would roll. The data leak would be traced to my credentials. I'd be the scapegoat. Clean, simple, career dead. I rewound the hours in my mind like a forensic tape. Her late nights, the sudden client emergency, the perfume that didn't belong to our home, the extra key in her purse she used for the storage unit. Each small discrepancy was a seam I could unzip. So I became a patient predator. I started with David. Following him wasn't hard. Men like him exist in patterns. Lunches at the same restaurants, meetings in the same anonymous conference suites, late-night calls in cars with privacy glass. I mapped his week into a matrix. Week numbers, times, associates, vehicles. I did it on paper first, something analog to anchor me, then cross-referenced with the feeds I could pull through the firm's legal but flexible monitoring tools. I trailed him in borrowed cars, kept my distance, took notes in my head so my hands wouldn't show on cameras. Used the cloak of mundane CEO errands to move around the city. Lang was careful until he wasn't. On the third week, in a downtown hotel lobby, he made a mistake. He took a call and, in a rare lapse of discretion, said Laura's name, loud enough for the sound system to pick up under the thrum of people and elevators. He said it like he owned her. That arrogance is a weakness. It always is. I planted the recorder in his office during a site survey, a job my firm had actually performed for one of his subsidiary companies years before. They trusted me. They'd even given me an access badge once that still embarrassingly worked on the old turnstiles. I used it quietly. The recorder fit inside a stapler. Technology is indulgent that way. Small things, big consequences. What Lang revealed in that office over the next 2 weeks was worse than a fair talk. He spoke in logistics, timelines, lists of people to manipulate, third parties, subcontractors, and to engineers he named who had access to firmware updates. Lang's arrogance was culinary. He thought he could fillet the system cleanly. He thought his leverage over Laura would be long enough to accomplish his goal and then discard her. I watched Laura closely during that time. People betray in patterns. She hadn't been the mastermind. She was an instrument lulled into complicity by charm and promises of security. I knew how the seduction looked. He'd flatter her, then use that yes to get the small things, a password, a hinge of access, until the big thing was possible. She wasn't a villain yet. She was an every woman who'd slipped into an unforgivable opportunity. Revenge, I had decided, would be surgical. Public ruin leaves scars. Violence leaves gore and witnesses. I needed something more precise, a disruption so intimate that it would remove everything they treasured and rewrite their identities without leaving fingerprints. The plan built itself in the hours I held Lang's voice in my ears. Expose him. Isolate Laura. Shatter his leverage by turning his own network against him. First step. Make Lang trust that his plan was succeeding. I fed him minor confirmations. Carefully staged leaks from fabricated sources suggesting that the firmware update had been queued and that an internal check would be scheduled on a seemingly unrelated date. He relaxed. He began to use more insecure channels. Arrogance breeds carelessness. He even started sending texts reinforcing the hotel meetings. Amateur mistakes. Idiot confidence. Second step. Secure plausible deniability for myself while preserving all evidence. I logged late-night entries into the office for show, set up false remote access sessions traced to clearly defined IPs, and then masked my real whereabouts at crucial times. I documented excuses I could produce if questioned, an important client call, an unavoidable audit at the firm. I seeded a narrative that would, on paper, make me look busy and innocent and, crucially, predictable. Third step. Prepare the collapse. I crafted an email server trick, a micro breach that would be undetectable to cursory logging but would create an internal sinkhole for the firmware package Lang wanted to use. Instead of routing the update to the client's sense array, the package would be diverted into a quarantine node I controlled, a harmless replica with a rollback trigger. When the rollback failed, logs would show tampering. When auditors came, they'd see attempted extraction of protected data from my credentials. Panic would ensue. Lang would run his contingency. He would reveal himself out of panic. It read like chess. Every piece had a purpose. Every move had a countermove. I enjoyed it. At least the part of me that took comfort in order enjoyed it. But revenge is also a psychological act. You want your enemy to feel the erosion of control, to sense their universe disintegrate while thinking their agency remains intact. So I added a psychological layer, create a pressure cooker around Laura, not harm her, but unmask her. She needed to feel what it truly meant to be collateral. I began by cutting the small comforts she believed were anonymous. A note slipped into her purse from an apparent admirer, my handwriting, disguised. A fish thank you for the interior design blog where she'd posted pictures of our home, with metadata planted to show she'd been uploading images from their hotel suite. Small things to nudge the pattern of doubt onto paper. I was careful. I didn't want to break her completely. There's a cruelty to breaking someone who is already broken in the soft places. I wanted her to hurt, but to still be human enough to react in ways that would expedite Lang's reveal. On a wet Thursday evening, I executed Phase 1. I triggered the sinkhole. The firmware packet arrived at our fake node and was quarantined. My script created an error, a breadcrumb of corrupted logs that would flag unusual extraction attempts. Within hours, the client's security team pinged my firm. My team responded with feigned horror and immediate cooperation. For theater, I dialed up my visible anxiety, performed long conference calls, late-night server checks, and issued public statements about unanticipated data anomalies. Lang panicked in ways rehearsed and beautiful. The recordings from inside the office, the stapler recorder captured him pacing, swearing, naming names, the very names I needed him to give. He started contacting people directly, demanding emergency fixes, and one of his associates slipped a reference to the location where the firmware could be retrieved, made in a whisper angry enough to be audible on the tape. That was my window. I staged the recovery like a rescue. I discovered that the quarantine firmware could be rolled back if a specific serial token, a hardware key that matched my client's embedded system, was used. It would appear that someone on our client's side had authorized the release. Lang, believing he was now in control, took the bait. He ordered the token to be delivered via an intermediary, the kind of transaction that leaves a trace but looks innocent. When the intermediary arrived, I followed him. He was trying to be invisible. He wasn't. Lang had taught me the patterns of men like him, habits of concealment that are as telling as footprints in the mud. I tailed the courier across 3 blocks of downtown, following his diagonal cuts through alleys, and then I watched him hand off the token to a woman I recognized, Laura. She looked brittle at night, a wet ghost of the woman I loved. The courier slipped away. Laura tucked the token into her bag like it was something sacred. The look on her face was not triumph. It was terror. I started recording with a device I could conceal in my palm. It was useless to simply know. I had to capture audio, movement, everything. The footage was not accusatory yet. It was documentary. When the firmware was installed, the rollback occurred. A minute later, alarms in my client's security portal indicated a mass access attempt from the credential tied to my account. Panic hit the firm like a tidal wave. Calls, lockdowns, code red protocols. My performance of frantic compliance continued. I claimed cooperation. I turned over every log we had. I offered to help. It's an old trick. Throw your hands up and volunteer, and people focus on your help, not your culpability. But Lang's arrogance had birthed a pattern I could manipulate. He rushed. Hubris is a combustive lubricant. He contacted the intermediary and the contact at the client directly. And in that rush he used a phone line and an account that left a tag pointing back to one of his shell operations. The breadcrumb was small, an IP range indexing to a city, then a device that pinged a coffee shop capture network. It was enough. It was everything. The police came on a Saturday, neutral. Bureaucratic men who read logs with the kind of dull efficiency I respected. Investigators want clean threads. They don't like drama. Their questions were surgical. When did the firmware request originate? Who had access tokens? Can you confirm the chain of custody? I gave them everything that fit. The narrative we were assembling, my willingness to cooperate, my firm's immediate outreach, the quarantine node, the restored package. I offered evidence of the mediator transaction, a receipt, a time-stamped surveillance clip from a downtown camera, a name spoken to loudly on a phone. It all pointed in a direction Lang would not expect, to his operations. The investigators found his shell accounts and the intermediary's email. They found the hotel receipts where Laura and the intermediary had stayed. They found the hardware token in a drawer of her studio, lazily tucked under swatches. When the investigators called Lang in for questioning, his composure cracked. People who orchestrate deception are rarely prepared to be exposed. They're performers who haven't rehearsed the part where the curtain falls on them. Under interrogation, he talked. He talked in ways that made his arrogance his undoing. Lang's voice in the transcript read like a confession. He'd used Laura to get me. He'd planned the ransomware-style extraction. He'd planned to sell the compromised data to a competitor. The investigators love patterns and motivations. Finding motive is as clean as a fingerprint on a glass. Laura sat in the interview room across from an investigator, and I sat on the other side of the one-way glass. a spectator with the most intimate seat in the house. I wanted to watch her break under truth, but the sight of her face, hollow, bewildered, oddly relieved, cinched something else inside me. She didn't look triumphant. She looked small. The affair that had threatened me looked suddenly petty in the cold fluorescence of the station. But that was the thing about revenge. You don't just want to punish the treacherous action. You want to erase the possibility of fraying your life that way again. I wanted Lang's power to evaporate, his money to sour into liability, and his future to be a record of failure. I also wanted Laura to understand what the dagger she'd been asked to hold had done to me. I wanted it to be irreversible. So I did the final, most cruelly efficient thing I had left. I rewrote public perception, using the logs I'd captured and the testimony Lang had provided under pressure. I created a dossier, not just a client brief, not a police report. A narrative document that could not be ignored. Bank transfers, offshore accounts, recorded conversations, the intermediary's passport, chain of custody of the rollback token. I delivered it anonymously to the press and to Lang's investors in a white glove package. I didn't smear him with lies. I gave them everything he'd earned, the truth. Within 48 hours, Lang's empire began to crumble. Investors called for meetings. The banks froze accounts pending compliance checks. His partner firms issued cautious statements. The market doesn't tolerate moral ambiguity when millions hang in the balance. It reacts ruthlessly to risk. Lang's name became a liability. His calls were redirected to voicemail. The men who once answered to him now whispered his actions in sterile boardrooms and sent him legal threats. He had no cash to me. Laura watched it all in stunned silence. She'd been transported from the coil of seduction into the center of a collapsible nightmare. She called me that night once, and then hung up. She left a voice message. She said two things: that she was sorry, and that she hadn't known how deep he intended to go. I listened to the message and turned the audio over in my head. Apologies run thin when the cost is reputation and safety. I wanted to put the phone through the wall. I wanted to shout. Instead, I folded the message into an encrypted archive, labeled in a way no other person would understand, and put it under the file that would never be opened. Lang hired lawyers and PR crisis managers and did what rich men do. He used everyone else's money to buy silence. But there's an economy for scandal that can't be medicated with money. There are reputations that die in public, and his was one of them. He found himself losing the simple things first: the invitations, the pretense, the casual power of walking into a room and being taken for granted. His world shifted from being a stage to being a courtroom. My revenge so far had been clean. I'd not ruined someone physically, not stolen or burned. I'd dismantled trust, the scaffolding upon which his ambitions had been built. I'd stripped his future and made it difficult to reconstruct. He would be forced into rebuilding with the knowledge that everything he did would now be watched. But there was still one piece missing: the social annihilation of the man who had used my life to get what he wanted. Public disgrace is a slow burn. I wanted to accelerate it. So I did the thing men with my training do when they want a finality. I exposed the one thing men like Lang thought untouchable: the private ledger I acquired through channels I own and controls I had cultivated over years, a copy of the contracts Lang's group used to launder funds. I made sure the ledger contained just enough legitimate business to hide in plain sight, and enough criminal omission to ensure a regulatory cascade. I forwarded it untraceably to the Department of Justice and to the same investors who were already jittery. The DOJ assigned a task force. Lang had to answer to investigators with subpoenas and legal penknives. His assets were frozen. The man who'd slept with my wife had access to worse things than my marriage, whole lines of culpability that required cleaning out. He would not walk away. It took 6 weeks, Bureaucracy is slow, but it is inexorable. The headlines moved from whisper to howling. Lang was on the cover of a weekend paper. The language was clinical and brutal: investment fraud, unauthorized data extraction, political contributions under scrutiny. I read it alone in the office, the city a blur on the glass, and felt no victory, only a hollow clarity. Laura left the city soon after. She packed a bag, left a note on the kitchen counter, an apology that read like a stranger's attempt at intimacy, and got on a midnight flight. I watched her leave from the window of our home as the plane traced a line across the sky and disappeared. I felt nothing. Grief is not a tidal wave, it's an erosion. You notice the land receding, and then understand that the ocean has won. There was an immediate and practical effect. My professional clients were wary for a while. Associates asked awkward questions. There were whispers about conflict of interest, about the man whose wife compromised their security. I fielded them, like minor injuries, bandaged statements, transparency memos, third-party audits. And then, when the storms cleared, something stranger happened. There was a curiosity about me I hadn't earned, the kind of respect men give when they see the edge of someone's appetite for consequence. A top-level client called me into a room with a problem no one else wanted to touch, the kind of problem that required discretion and the willingness to make unpleasant things happen. He offered more money than sense. He offered leverage I had not sought. He offered the kind of work that pulled at the darker parts of what I did. I took the case. Revenge had a price. The ledger I used to bankrupt Lang made me valuable in markets where men like him still trafficked in secrets. Companies that feared being exposed now wanted me on retainer. The irony was delicious. By destroying Lang, I had become a man worth destroying if the situation reversed. That night, in the calm after long weeks, I sat alone at the kitchen table, photos of Laura tucked safely into a file drawer, the whiskey particular and cheap. I had what I wanted. Lang's ruin, Laura gone. But the taste in my mouth was metal. My revenge had been surgical, efficient. It had been clean in the way a scalpel is clean. And yet there was a hollowness the victories could not fill, as if the world was rearranged but the hole inside me was the same volume. While I told myself I'd done it for justice, a smaller truth sat like a stone in my chest. I'd enjoyed it, the planning, the precision, the moral chess. There was a thrill in watching a man's architecture of power fall like dominoes. That pleasure terrified me more than anything Lang's worst abuse could, because the other truth continued to sit under everything else. Someone had scripted the first betrayal for me. Someone had created the conditions in which Lang could be as bold as he was. The affair, the access, the token, these were not random. They were contours on a map that looked eerily like a trap. I had pulled a string and watched the puppet fall. But what if the puppet had been nudged by a hand I hadn't seen? It left a new question I hadn't planned for. Who had wanted me out of the way and why? That thought was dangerous in a different way. It suggested actors with reach and influence. It suggested that this event wasn't just personal payback but also part of a broader architecture of power where men like Lang dance at one end and larger predators operate in the dark. Kept that question like a loaded gun. I folded it into the dossier I would never give to anyone. It was for my eyes, for the future. The truth had teeth, and I would not be surprised when they bit. The house felt too quiet. I poured another glass and sat in the chair Laura had once liked, stared at the city, and let the night breathe. The case I'd accepted set microfilm cold in my email. A corporate board afraid, a CEO uncooperative. The threads were visible again. Connections were a map I could read. Revenge had closed a door. It had also opened a host of windows, and the city was full of people who now wanted me to climb through. I promised myself one rule. Whatever I did next, I would not become a man whose hands were stained beyond recognition. I would not let the dark become my new home. But the truth, as I had learned, is a slippery thing. It demands payment, and it never forgets the man who thinks he is done collecting. You learn early in this line of work that networks are never tidy. They're messy, knotted things, the kind of thing that looks like a random tangle until you pull the right wire and the whole thing unravels. I knew how to find the right wire, but I didn't know how many hands had already wrapped it. Lang's ruin had left footprints, and footprints lead somewhere. I told myself I was chasing the hand that nudged the puppet on my stage. That sounded clean. It felt like purpose. It was also, I would learn, naive. The first break came from an account I didn't expect. One of Lang's lower-level show companies. It had been set up as a holding LLC in Delaware, the sort of legal gray mattress these men sleep on. I pulled public filings that morning, not because I thought anything spectacular would be there, but because in my experience, repetition breeds truth. Companies that launder influence love patterns, the same registered agents, the same poll boxes, the same 2 or 3 lawyers who reappear like clockwork. The LLC's registered agent name matched nothing on the surface, but the email used to register it, a burner that pinged off a service I knew how to query. The chain led, predictably, to a trust, and the trust led to a name I'd heard in passing at too many industry dinners, Elliot Crane. Not the polite Elliot who bought a table at a museum gala once a year, but the Elliot Crane who buys coastal developments and disappears into a net of nonprofits and private equity, the kind of man whose philanthropy is a veil. Crane's public face was immaculately benign: school endowments, art wing donations, urban revitalization projects whose PR photos always included smiling kids and shiny playgrounds. It's always kids in these stories, charts of giving and a photo op. His private face, the one that shows up in leaked intermediary lists and compromised contracts, was what got people access, influence, and immunity. Lang's ledger included wire transfers to one of Crane's projects, an emergency shell used to funnel consulting fees. The sums were too tidy to be accidental. Someone had paid Lang for muscle, and whoever that someone was had the patience to let the affair play out long enough to leverage it. That wasn't the act of a street-level predator. That was the work of a cleaner who placed bets on variables beyond sex and scandal. I started with Crane's calendar. Philanthropists keep schedules. Their calendars reveal the same predictable orbit of donors and board meetings. I bribed a concierge, a soft expense, and a favor I could trade for later, who walked me past the velvet rope of one of Crane's private fundraisers. I wore a suit that suggested I had no business being questioned, and I smiled like I did this for a living. The place smelled like lemon oil and old money. Men in jackets that cost more than my car circled the room with trays of champagne and reinventions. Crane moved like a man with a map in his head. He met the right people at the right tables, said the right things into the right ears. He was small, in a way that made his presence feel concentrated, like a light bulb you could focus. He gave a speech about infrastructure and dignity and falling through the cracks. He used words like stability and vision. He used them the way predators use charm. What I wasn't looking for and what I found was a photograph. I saw it on a side table, a framed image half-shaded by a lamp, Lang and Crane, laughing in front of a property under development, the kind of photo meant for cronies. Past that, the concierge tablet sparked a subtle notification, and for a sliver of chance, I caught a name in a planning note on the device. Meridian Acquisition Partners. Meridian. That name had floated in the margins of a dozen contracts I'd audited. Meridian was a private equity fund, the sort of entity that buys distressed assets and, using a tangle of debt, makes small fortunes while the towns it buys die. Meridian's logos were anonymous. Their board meetings were rarer than the rarest wine. And Elliot Crane sat on an advisory panel with a profile that read like a passport to leverage. I followed Meridian like you follow a scent. Their filings curled through offshores, shelldows, and passive investor accounts. I found purchase orders. I found subcontractors. I found small notes in invoices that said things like confidential facilitation fee. The facilitator in multiple documents was a consulting firm from our own client list, a firm I had worked with and, more importantly, one whose security I had helped design. The deeper I went, each grew. Someone had wanted me out of the way, and not because Lang desired the contract. Lang was a means. Meridian, Crane, but trust, those were the authors. It's one thing to find a name. It's another to know the human who sits behind it, the one who makes the decisions and likes the smoke of risk. That's where I made my next move. I identified the conversation that had been stapled together in Lang's files, a meeting that took place 3 months prior in a private room at the Wellesley Club, an old moneyman's place with a soft-voiced concierge and an easier-to-gain membership if you knew the right lawyer. The attendee list included an investor, an acquisitions manager, and a man I didn't know who wrote his first name simply as G. I bought a room in that club for 24 hours. I read minutes. I scanned receipts. I paid a waiter who would leave a cigarette-burning page beneath a teacup. The clue I needed wasn't in the minutes. It was in a signature on an expense report. G. Mercer, a name that means nothing until you find a LinkedIn trail. Gareth Mercer, CEO of an energy firm whose federal relationships were deep and whose political donations made him untouchable. Gareth Mercer. Deep pockets. Deeper friends. Mercer's presence opened another door, a procurement clause in a state-level infrastructure bid that Meridian had won, a bid that would profit from the data Silvercore's client controlled. Suddenly the motive wasn't only corporate greed, it was geopolitical leverage. Whoever controlled Silvercore's data flows could steer municipal contracts, sway city planning, decide who got the zoning variances. It was less about stealing a file than about flipping a city. I began to connect dots that didn't want to be connected. Lang's role shifted from lover to foot soldier. David Lang had been a cockroach someone placed against a wall to see where the termites lived. The affair, the token, the firmware, they were distractions for a wider assault on systems I'd helped secure. I pushed my luck. I pulled strings in corners I thought safe. And Meridian's people noticed. They don't notice everything. They notice patterns and anomalies. My presence in the Wellesley Club had been a blip. Their private intelligence units flagged it. I found out because my entry badge to the firm, the very one I'd used daily for a decade, suddenly failed to open a side door. Someone had updated the access matrix. Someone had carved me out of the permissions I once owned. It meant they were watching. I became the thing a lot of my clients feared, a hunted man carrying evidence. That's when the stakes stopped being theory and became very practical. My car was broken into, not to steal but to send a message. The dashcam I installed in the glove compartment recorded a pair of hands riffling through the glove box and then finding nothing of value. There was a folded piece of paper on the passenger seat when I got back. A single line typed in plain font. Stop pulling threads. I read it twice and then set the paper on fire in the sink. The smoke smelled like cheap ink and a threat made with confidence. The reaction I expected, retreat, never came. I'd never been a good retreating man. Instead, I escalated. I pulled a favor from an old contact at the Department of Justice, a polite man named Ephraim Cole, who'd once been a regulator before he'd moved into consulting. I owed him a debt from an audit we performed that saved a small town's hospital. He returned the favor, not by opening a case to public, but by whispering. Watch the procurement logs for Mercer's companies, he said, and be careful with the people who call themselves friends. I watched. I stitched together phone records, public procurement timelines, and the timing of the firmware update that Lang wanted. Mercer's firm donated to the same political campaign that signed off on a zoning contract the week the firmware was scheduled. The proximity was statistical, then suggestive, and finally damning once you added motive. It should have been enough. It wasn't, because at 2 a.m., the night after I'd traced Mercer's donations to the council member who'd quietly pushed the ordinance, Someone slashed my tires in the garage. They left the car in a way that made it roll, not enough to kill, but enough to remind me of my mortality when the car jolted and banged against a concrete column. The message was clear. We can inconvenience you, Michael. We can make you afraid. Fear is useful. Fear makes people mistake noise for meaning, and then they either run or freeze. I did neither. Instead, I went to the quietest place I knew, the attic of my childhood home, a dusty place with a window that looked out over a row of roofs. I sat there until dawn, the city a low heartbeat, and thought about the sequence of actions that had brought me here. I thought about Lang's last look, the man I'd watched die on that boat, and about Laura's face when she left, small and haunted. I thought about Crane and Mercer, and about how men with wealth erase other men's lives the way landscapers prune hedges. Clean cuts. No one sees the roots until it's too late. I lit a cigarette I didn't want, and made a decision I'd felt forming since the day the hotel message arrived. If you want to dismantle a machine, you don't start with the gears. You start with the power source, the people with the access, the way the contracts are written, the political favors that grease the wheels. You make them vulnerable in places they thought were invisible. I had a name now. I had proof. I had an ally who owed me a favor. And I had a man I had humbled, and a woman I couldn't forget without becoming someone else. The web was larger than any single affair. It was corporate, municipal, political, a lattice of intent and money that moved with surgical indifference. So I began the next phase. I would go after Meridian's public face, making it crack slowly until it revealed the live wiring behind it. I would force Crane and Mercer to show their hands, to answer for the people who moved boxes and signatures. I would not be violent. That had been my rule. I would be another kind of violence, financial, reputational, surgical. There was one more thing I learned in those quiet hours. You rarely get to pick the weapon that saves you. Sometimes the instrument of your survival is the same one you used to make the first cut. I'd arranged the first domino. Now I had to be sure the fall would reach the men who had placed them. I walked down from the attic as the city exhaled, my knuckles still smoking from the cigarette. The plan was messy and dangerous. It would put me where men like Mercer could find me, and where the people who still wanted me out would send their silence. But I had one advantage these men never considered. Anger turns into strategy when you don't let it burn you. It cools into patterns, into timelines, into documents that can be weaponized. I had the documents. I had a thread, and I intended to pull until the whole suit unraveled. The first pull began at 09:00, with a courier named Ana Ruiz who worked for a shipping company Mercer used for equipment. She'd driven a nondescript van the night Lang met the intermediary. She would be where the next paper trail started. I made a call to a contact who handled physical surveillance, a woman named Samira who owed me for rescuing her brother from a bad contract years ago. She picked up on the second ring. "Samira," I said, "I need a tail on a van. I need eyes, not noise. This goes quiet." There was a pause, and then her voice was all business. "You finally decided to stop playing chess in your head and move the rook, Michael. I'll be there at 09:00. Don't give them anything to surveil." I hung up and, for the first time since the hotel message, felt like I wasn't the only man in a room full of ghosts. The game was bigger now, and the players were too numerous for one man to topple with a single hand. But sometimes you don't topple a tower with a single strike. You need the foundations until the mortar gives. I poured coffee that morning that tasted like the city, bitter and cold, and laid out the files. The thread had a name. It had a motive. It had greed, and above all, it had an index. Meridian Acquisition Partners. I'd picked up the phone and called Elliot Crane's office. The line picked up on the third ring, a woman answering with a smile I had heard before in quiet rooms where men make deals. "Mr. Crane isn't available," she said. "May I take a message?" "Yes," I said, and then I told her a lie so clean it would become a key. "Tell him Michael Cross says hello." and that I'm about to hand a dossier to a man he once called a friend. I'll be at the Wellesley Club at noon. If he wants to talk, he knows where to find me. The lie would do more than inform. It would set a reaction. Men like Crane have a reflex. When someone whispers of dossiers and friends, they look for the exit. They send underlings. They trip alarms. And in those reflexive moments, they show muscle. I waited. At noon a car rolled up outside the club, not driven by Crane but by a clean-pressed associate. He stepped from the vehicle and walked into the club with a brow furrowed. He carried a phone like a talisman. His eyes darted like a man who knows he's being watched. Samira texted me at 11:54. Van on the move? Ruiz is driving to the north terminal. You're on mine. I have 2 tails and a drone. Good. My hand tightened around the cup. The thread was moving, and wherever it led, I would follow. I didn't know yet whether I'd find monsters or men with human flaws. I only knew this: if there was a hand that had set Lang and Laura on this track, it would not like the light I was about to shine. The morning Crane's associate walked into the Wellesley Club. I already knew the conversation wouldn't be about peace. Men like him don't negotiate with ghosts. They erase them. He was the kind of man who'd never had to raise his voice. He didn't introduce himself, but his cufflinks said enough gold engraved with the Meridian logo I'd seen buried in procurement filings. His presence wasn't an accident. It was a declaration. "Mr. Cross," he said, sliding into the chair opposite mine. "You've made quite a bit of noise." "Elliot prefers quiet," he said. "Elliot like a priest saying God." I let him talk. The key to men who deal in threats is patience. They think silence is submission. It's actually strategy. He went on, outlining the usual script: legal exposure, reputation, career suicide, veiled physical danger, the whole walk away and live performance. I waited until he finished his little sermon, and then slid a flash drive across the table. "Tell your boss," I said, "that this contains everything I've found: emails, wire records, property transfers. But here's the fun part. It doesn't. The real file is in escrow, encrypted, and timed for release if anything happens to me. You follow me?" He didn't blink. That was how I knew he did. He leaned forward. "You don't know what you're touching." "Oh, I do," I said. "And I'm not touching it, I'm pulling it apart." He stood up without another word, walked out. No handshake. The type who reports back to someone who hates uncertainty more than exposure. I left 5 minutes later through the kitchen exit. There's a rhythm to this kind of warfare. Strike, vanish, misdirect. That night, I got a call from Samira. "Your girl Ruiz," he said. "She's not just a courier. She's logistics for something bigger. Warehouse outside Red Hook. Night activity, no manifests. I met her there just before midnight. The air smelled like salt and diesel. We parked far enough to avoid cameras, but close enough to watch the patterns: trucks moving in, workers who didn't look like dock laborers. Every van carried identical crates stamped MAP Construction Supplies, Meridian Acquisition Partners. Cute. We waited until a truck backed up and one of the workers dropped a clipboard. Samir zoomed in with the drone camera. The manifest label read, "Fiber Conduit, Proprietary Data Line Equipment." That's when it clicked. They weren't just stealing Silver Core's firmware, they were building the network to deploy it. A shadow data grid, a private pipeline piggybacking on municipal fiber. Whoever controlled it would own every byte flowing through city infrastructure. Water, transport, surveillance, everything. And my name had once been on the design proposal. Lang hadn't just been bait. He was my replacement, installed to sign off the integration once I was discredited or dead. It wasn't corporate espionage anymore. It was infiltration. We broke into the warehouse at 2 o'clock a.m. Samira killed the power. Inside, the air was cold and humming with residual energy. We moved fast: photos, serials, internal memos. Every label led to the same contractor network, one owned by a Crane shell company in partnership with Mercer Energy Holdings. Then we found it, a sealed server rack in the back, operational, hooked into a private satellite who blinked. No city project had clearance for that. The login screen displayed a codename, a Renault. Jesus, Samira whispered. This isn't infrastructure. It's surveillance. Not just that, I said. It's control. A Renault wasn't about data theft, it was about data direction. Real-time manipulation of infrastructure, from energy grids to public communication systems. With that, they could rewrite truth at scale. Elections, markets, entire realities, all hidden inside the wires. And I'd helped design the encryption layer 5 years ago. I pulled the drive bay, cloned the system, and we left through the emergency door before security could reset power. At 3:30, as we crossed the bridge back into the city, Samira's phone buzzed. She looked at it and swore softly. They already know. A photo message. It showed her brother's car parked outside his apartment. Caption, tell Michael to stop. By dawn, I'd moved Samira's family into a safe house I kept under an old alias. It wasn't the first time I'd seen fear crawl into someone's eyes, but this time it landed differently, because this wasn't about her brother, it was about me. They wanted me to feel accountable, and that meant they were getting nervous. I didn't sleep. I laid out the evidence I had, financial flows, shell structures, server images, proof enough to ruin men if released properly. But this wasn't a case for the police. Too many politicians in Crane's pocket. I needed a cleaner hand, someone who could act without jurisdiction, someone who owed no one favors. Ephraim Cole, when I called, he didn't ask how I got his private number. He just said, you finally reached the part where it stops being about betrayal and starts being about treason. I told him everything. He listened in silence, then said, bring me the drives. And bring your will in a sealed envelope. I'm not dying, Ephraim. He sighed. Michael, men like Mercer and Crane don't kill you for silence. They kill you to set an example. At noon I met Cole at a diner off the highway. A place with bad coffee and good anonymity. He took the drive, plugged it into an encrypted reader, and scrolled. His face changed halfway through. They built a backdoor into the city's control systems, he said. You realize what that means? I do. This is federal. This is beyond federal. You drop this in the wrong hands, and you're not a whistleblower, you're a loose end. I stared out the window at the freeways. Loose ends are just threads no one was brave enough to pull. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. All right, I'll open a quiet channel. But if they trace this back to you, they already have. When I got home that evening, the lock was broken. My apartment was silent, except for the faint sound of a record spinning on the player I hadn't touched in years. Laura's favorite song. There was a single glass on the counter half full, and on the table, a note. You were never supposed to find the truth, but I knew you would try. Please, stop before they take what's left of you. I'll dot her handwriting. The looped letters. The steady, practiced calm. It could have been old, or recent, but the scent of her perfume on the page wasn't a memory, it was fresh. I stood there in silence for a long time. Not grief, not confusion, just a cold, mechanical understanding that every move I'd made had been anticipated, that someone, maybe even her, was still playing. Then my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I answered, a man's voice. Calm, polished. Mercer. Michael, he said. We need to talk. Somewhere neutral. You have something of ours. I have a lot of things, I said. You'll need to be specific. Let's not make this ugly. There's more at stake here than you understand. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Battery Pier. Come alone. He hung up. I looked out the window. The skyline was a line of cold knives. The world below hummed like circuitry. Tomorrow I'd walk into the open, and for the first time, I wouldn't know whether I was chasing revenge or stepping into a trap built by the same hands I'd spent months trying to expose. But I'd go anyway, because sometimes the only way to kill a system is to bleed inside it. The morning came slow and gray, like the city itself was holding its breath. I didn't bother shaving, didn't pack a weapon, either. There's no point carrying steel into a conversation where the real blade is already at your throat. Battery Pier was empty except for the gulls and the wind. East River churned with cold light. I stood by the railing, scanning reflections in the glass buildings behind me. When Mercer arrived, he did so quietly, dark coat, perfect tie, two men shadowing him at a distance. "Michael," he said, like we were colleagues catching up after a long business trip. "I was hoping it wouldn't come to this." "I'm sure you were." He smiled slightly. "You've done a lot of damage. People are nervous. But you're smarter than they give you credit for. So let's speak plainly." He gestured to the bench. "I didn't move. You uncovered something you weren't meant to see," Mercer said. "But we both know you're not stupid enough to think this was just theft or fraud. Aurora wasn't designed for money. It was designed for stability. Control, yes, but the kind that keeps this city from tearing itself apart." "Control," I said. "That's what you call it. You build a private infrastructure that watches every bite, every face, every life, and you call that stability." He sighed. "You call it surveillance. I call it prevention. Crime, collapse, information warfare. We built the firewall the government was to paralyze to create." I laughed quietly. "You built a cage. And you made me design the lock." He tilted his head. "You talk about vengeance, but vengeance for what? Your wife, she made her choices. You made yours. She understood the game before you did." My chest went cold. "What did you say?" Mercer's eyes didn't move. "Laura was ours, Michael. Long before you knew her. She believed in the system. You were simply the architect who got too close to his own creation." He watched the realization hit. "The files. The contract. The night she left. It wasn't betrayal. It was a recruitment. She hadn't cheated on me with another man. She'd chosen another side." My world shrank to a single point. Mercer stood, brushed invisible dust off his sleeve. "You can walk away, take the money, disappear, or keep pushing and vanish in a way that doesn't involve choice." I said nothing. He turned to leave. That's when I told him, "You're late." He stopped. "Look back. You think I came here alone?" I said, "That's cute. The file's already been uploaded. Every contract, every transfer, every note of Aurora. By noon, it'll be on every journalist's desk from here to Geneva." Mercer smiled again, not the kind of smile that hides panic, but the kind that masks inevitability. "You always think exposure changes anything. It doesn't. People don't care about the truth, Michael. They care about comfort. And we own that." He walked away, slow and unhurried. His men followed. By noon, I was back in my apartment, sitting on the floor amid the wreckage of my own obsession. The leak went public exactly as planned. But Mercer was right about one thing: the world didn't burn. It blinked, gasped, and went back to scrolling. A few headlines. Some outrage. Then silence. Samira texted once. "It's out. You did it. Get out of town." I didn't reply. Outside, the sirens never stopped. But inside, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that follows the end of something. Enormous and meaningless at the same time. I opened the envelope I'd written weeks ago, the one Cole told me to prepare just in case. Inside was a single sentence: "If revenge doesn't free you, it becomes your next prison." I burned it in the sink, watched the smoke curl upward and vanish. Then I opened my laptop. Aurora node was still active. Of course it was. You can't kill a system built into the bloodstream of a city. You can only learn to speak its language. So I did. I logged into one of the backdoors I'd built months ago, the one Mercer didn't know existed, the one tied to his personal account. And as the sun fell over the skyline, I started rewriting the permissions layer, line by line. I wasn't destroying the system anymore. I was taking it. If you're reading this, maybe you think this is a confession. Maybe it is. But understand one thing: vengeance isn't fire. It's gravity. Once you fall into it, you don't climb out. You just keep falling, until the only thing left to destroy is yourself. Somewhere, a city blinked. 1,000 cameras turned in unison. And this time, they answered to me.